My next guest is Jen Otte. She is an innovative educational leader with over 20 years of experience as both a teacher and administrator. After teaching high school social studies for 17 years, Jen stepped into her current role as a high school associate principal. In both positions, and as a stepmom of two teenagers for over a decade, Jen began to realize that a lot that she and fellow educators needed to learn and understand was about the teenage brain. She is the founder of the Teenage Brain Thing, a resource that in professional development framework and action plan to help educators tap into the potential of the teenage brain. Jen believes that if teachers understand and embrace the unique needs of the teenagers sitting before them, then they will increase their job satisfaction, fall in love with teaching again, and see more academic success from their students. She is presented at the national level at the NASSP annual conference in 2024 and at the AMLE annual conference in 2025, where I went to Jen's session,
Mhm.
as well as at the local level in her home state of Connecticut. It is always eager to hear from and work with middle and high school teachers and leaders. Outside of education, she enjoys spending time with her family, her two yellow labs, Birdie and Bear, as well as writing her Peloton and traveling to new places. She's traveled with high school students as far away as China, Ghana, Nepal, and India. Well, welcome to the podcast, Jen.
Thank you so much, Dana, for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to chat with you today. So,
Yes. So as I mentioned, I went to your session on the
mhm.
teenage brain at AMLE and that piqued my interest. So we're going to be talking about that on the podcast. But first of all, we'll start off with tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Okay, excellent. So, I think the thing that comes to mind, and when we were discussing this question beforehand, and from what I've listened to some of your other guests too, is one thing that came to mind is that when I was teaching a number of years ago, so I've been out of the classroom for 6 years. I've been an administrator for 6 years. I came into administration in 2019, right before the pandemic. So I really have had an administrative experience that was very reactive. If we remember the time of, it feels like so long ago, but the one-way hallways and the kids not having the masks above their nose and the where is this, the hand sanitizer lotion. And so I feel like a lot of it was very reactive. But in both my administrative experiences and both in teaching, the one thing I think about of coming out of the trenches is this feeling of trying to fit some particular type of educational mold.
Mm-hmm.
I have an example. I taught social studies, like I said, for 17 years. I taught U.S. history a handful of years. I mostly taught world history and
Okay.
sociology. And so I was teaching U.S. history one of the couple of years that I did that, and I was teaching with my department chair, my boss, and who I respect and still respect. I respected and still respect. And she was sort of guiding me along with what the lessons should look like. And I felt like I was trying to fit into her clothing. And it was such an uncomfortable, and not her physical clothing, but like the clothing of the lessons. Although that would still be very uncomfortable because we were very different shapes. But I remember feeling so uncomfortable and hating my job right then because I was trying to do it someone else's way.
Yeah.
And I felt like the kids could feel it, because I would rush through lessons because I'm trying to get through them because I didn't have the timing right. The cadence essentially of how I was talking was off. I just felt very uncomfortable. And I remember a moment, probably about a quarter or maybe halfway through the year, where I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And I want to be me. I just want to be me. And so I had a conversation with her about how I needed to change what I was doing because I didn't like how I was trying to fit into her design. And so
Yeah.
I started to do things a little differently. And I feel like that also morphed into my job as an administration. I work in a high school. I'm the associate principal. So there's a principal above me, then there's me, and then there's our dean of students. And it's the same thing with that situation. It's
Yeah.
like the worst days that I feel like I have are the days when I'm trying to be like somebody else, where I'm trying
Mm-hmm.
to lead or teach like someone else. And I have a very different personality from my principal. I love him dearly, but I will never be at the high school at 5 o'clock in the morning like he
Yeah.
is. I will never. I come in at 7. My time's supposed to be 7:15, 7:05 to 7:15. I'm just like, I have a different life. I live farther away. And so I feel like when I'm thinking of feeling very constrained by my system. It's when I'm trying to pretend or trying to act and be someone that I'm not. We had last spring, we had a horrible experience in our school. We had a death of a teacher in our school, and it took place in our school, and it was a horrific day. We came together as a school, but I remember when I came back into the building the next day, we had closed school for that day, and I just while everyone else was sort of doing what they needed to do, I felt like the one thing I wanted to do that would fit well for me was I wanted to call every teacher and para in our building just to just check in on them because I didn't know the level of how each person was sort of hurting or kneeling to sort of heal. And I remember my principal saying, "You do you want me to take some of the calls?" And I was like, "Nope, because this fits me. Like this is what I want to do. This is different from you." You know, he was very logical in doing what he needed to do to still support our school. And so when I think of the trenches, I think of, you know, really trying to, for me, it was going through the motions and trying to be someone I wasn't. And
Yeah.
I'm grateful to sort of have figured that out. I will say, like, I still have to work on it all the time. Like, I still have the imposter syndrome of
Yeah.
being a leader or, being an educator in general of like, I think sometimes hits a lot, but that's the thing that I think of when I think of out of the trenches is it's not fitting someone else's design or expectation and sort of doing it my way because that's what makes me feel comfortable. So,
Yeah, yeah. And when you were talking about those lessons, I feel similar when I was supposed to be teaching something called total physical response when I was
mhm.
teaching French, and I got
Oh,
lessons from a another teacher who had been teaching that for a long time, and I was trying to use like her method, and I
yeah.
observed her and tried to mimic, and it just I realized after a while it didn't work for me.
Yeah.
So
And it feels uncomfortable and it feels like you're not being genuine. And it just felt like I didn't like my job. I didn't, it was like, I hated teaching that particular class. And, you feel like there's this, I remember my favorite lessons were the lessons where it's like I knew exactly what was coming next, that particular punchline. It's what I feel in my presentations now too. I know the cadence of sort of when to expect a little bit of a laugh or like
Mhm.
when I try to emphasize a particular thing that feels and just it feels right. Like it feels like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And yeah, trying to fit into something else does not feel right. And you begin to start to resent that position. And so I was glad to have sort of made that discovery early on,
Mhm.
so I didn't because I feel like some young teachers who feel like they are trying to hit every standard and trying to hit every learning target and hit every expectation um, can get pretty burnt out because if it's not feeling like it fits their own personality and their design. I can totally see how some of my younger teachers and even mid-career veteran teachers who are just have sort of had enough of that. So I'm
Yeah.
glad to have sort of thought of that, although I have to keep repeating it over and over again for myself now as an administrator. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really that self-reflection piece. So,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So you talked a little bit about just your roles and how you've been in an AVP role now for 6 years. Talk to me about also gaining teenage stepkids was part
Yeah.
of your journey to wanting to research teenage brains.
Yeah. Yeah. It's my favorite story. And we're going to repeat this because I believe I shared this story at the
Mhm.
conference. But um, I met my husband through a former student of mine who
Mhm.
is, so I'll just tell the story just because it's fun. I take students, as I said, as you mentioned in the intro, I take students on trips. So I started early on in my social studies teaching career, teaching human rights and getting really interested in working with young people to figure out how they can change the world. And so I created a club at my second district that I worked in as a social studies teacher called Be the Change, based upon Mahatma Gandhi's Be the Change You Wish to See in the World. And so we went to, I had a great group of girls. There were all 6 girls in 2012, which seems like so long ago now that I'm saying that number out loud.
Yeah.
And they wanted to do a trip. They wanted to do a volunteer trip. And so we found an organization and we went to Ghana in the summer of 2012. Such a successful trip that 2 years later, I planned another trip to Nepal. And at that trip, I had a student say to me, my maiden name was Gambala. Miss Gambala, I think you should go out with my uncle. And so I, kind of laughed it off. And then on the airplane ride home, she was like, no, you should give me your number. So I gave her my number and I married him about 2 years later. And so he had two children. So my stepdaughter was 10 when I met her, and my stepson was 8. And they are now going to be 22 and 20. And so prior to living with them and working with them closely and loving them and taking care of them and kind of very quickly moving into the stepmom role, I don't have my own children, and I didn't live with children. And so it started to shift right around when my stepdaughter was in 6th grade.
Okay.
It started to shift my perspective of kids because I was a teacher who would assign homework and like we all do, and just expect like it just somehow got done. And if
Yeah.
it didn't get done, I dealt with it in school. And so now I'm a teacher going home to a kid who's receiving homework or receiving work, and my stepdaughter is neurodivergent, ADHD, some anxiety, and at that point was dealing with some Tourette's as well, that had sort of some tics that had been pulled on as part of her anxiety. And so explaining homework and trying to reteach and just kind of working through understanding what was happening with her brain and then with
Mhm.
my stepson's brain as he became older, because although really the biology of the brain is very different, the hormones and the reaction to the outside world is incredibly different for both boys and for both, female and male brains. So I started to study it a little bit more. And then when I moved into my administrative world, it was more about restorative practices. It was trying to
Yeah.
figure out, you know, now I am the person responsible for dealing with some of this bad behavior. And I have to
Mhm.
kind of understand more about where does this bad behavior come from. And so I started reading books. And then I got so excited about the stuff that I was learning that I worked with my dean of students at the time, and then a school psychologist, and to put together just a mini presentation about the teenage brain
Mhm.
with my district. And then that morphed into learning more about the facts that I was beginning to sort of pull apart with my district. So it became this like real passion project of mine that has now become the teenage brain thing. And as part of the introduction stated, it's this framework and essentially a platform and a resource for teachers that leads a lot into professional development, because I truly honestly believe that when educators understand the nuances of the teenage brain, and then that's the important part, and then they shift their practices to account for what they now know about the brain, that
Mhm.
kids do better, that teachers feel better, that schools are just more successful. And it's a lot of work. It's not like a one and done sort of, this is a three-part
Yeah.
thing and just do
Yeah.
this and that's you're done. It's much bigger than just that. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, my children here, who again are not children anymore, although still teenagers,
Mhm.
because the teenage brain is 10 to 25, although some studies are showing now that the brain isn't really fully developed until the early 30s.
Mhm.
So we're looking at way past college now if those studies are accurate. But I like the 10 to 25, essentially 5th grade through, graduate
Yeah.
school is what we're looking at. So my near 22 and 20-year-old are still very much, inside that particular part of their brain. So,
Mhm. Mhm. So, where did you start to go when you decided to research, not only for this presentation, but beyond that, when you started to dive deeper? What are some key books you might have read or
yeah.
researchers you decided to follow?
Yep. So there's one by Dr. Francis Jensen,
Okay.
essentially just called The Teenage Brain, um, that was really an incredible resource for me. There's another one. So that's the one that kind of piqued it for me because each chapter was very specific and different, and it especially
Mhm.
touched upon things that I think are really important for parents. And part of what, in my presentations, I have a variety of different presentations. The one that I did for AMLE, where you saw, was one specifically about joy and how dopamine, as the receptor that we feel or that releases when we feel, pleasure or feelings of happiness, that clears the pathways between a really, really illuminated part of the brain, which is the emotional brain that's inside teenagers, and it clears the pathway from the emotional brain to the thinking brain.
Mhm.
I picked up the triune brain, which is the three parts: instinctual, emotional, and then thinking, because your brain grows from the back to the front from the Incredible Teenage Brain, which is a book by Bettina Hoden.
Okay.
Um, so I took information from hers and I really kind of gathered it all together and put it together in a variety of different presentations. The biggest thing that I think that educators and parents get wrong, in my opinion, about teenagers is that they think that they're very different from teenagers before.
Yeah.
I partially agree with that. I I agree that teenagers feel very different, but
Hmm.
every teenager from generations and generations really have the same innate needs. They
Yeah.
want to feel seen, they want to feel safe, they want to feel secure, soothed, and understood as who they are. Like the four S's is what I talk about in my presentations. It doesn't matter if you were a teenager growing up in the 2020s or the 2000s, the 1950s, the 1800s, any of them. They have those same feelings. And the emotional brain, essentially the limbic system, which is where all of the big emotions are, our memory, our feelings of joy, and our sadness, our feelings of safety, all live in the limbic system. And for teenagers, this part of the brain is on. It is on all the time, and literally nothing can get through it,
Hmm.
or get through to the rational part of the brain, the thinking brain, until it goes through the emotional brain first. So in my
Hmm.
presentation at AML Elite, talked about how dopamine essentially clears the pathway from the emotional brain to the thinking brain. Now, if we look backwards to say the 1950s, or yeah, to the 1950s, and even earlier, I think all teenagers still lived in their emotional brain. The difference with teenagers now is the world around them is so different
Yeah.
that we think about, like, I think back to being a teenager, my first crushes, and the first time I went to the dances, and the first time I had a job, and all of that stuff feels very simple. I mean, I didn't have the internet. I didn't grow up in the internet. I had a rotary phone in my parents' bedroom and another, other phone, a landline. Um,
Hmm.
when we think of the state of the world, especially the state of the world right now in the beginning of 2026,
Yeah.
it's hard for even us as adults to regulate our emotions and think about how do we navigate the complexities of what's happening around us. A teenager can't do that. And yet they're bombarded. And they're bombarded with it because they see it on their phones, they see it on the internet, they see it in advertisements, they hear it on podcasts, although I don't really think very many teenagers are probably listening to podcasts, but they're
Yeah.
exposed to a lot more of the world. That's what makes them really
Sure.
challenging. But at the very base level, they are internally living in their emotional brain, trying to just navigate a very complex world. Um, so, The Teenage Brain by Dr. Frances Jensen was great. The Incredible Teenage Brain by Bettina Honan. Some of the bigger books um,
Hmm.
that I have read recently are The Disengaged Teen
Okay.
by Rebecca Winthrop and Jenny Anderson. I actually did a book talk with administrators last summer here in
Okay.
Connecticut, and I invited Jenny Anderson, and I invited both of them. Jenny Anderson graciously accepted my invite and was part of my book talk. That book talks about a real crisis in engagement with teenagers, feeling like they're not connected to what they're learning. And I think that's why they seek out the easy outs, like AI. I believe there
Yeah.
was just a recent study about the changes of the brain for AI, and I can't wait to kind of dig into that study a little bit more. Um, but that book talks about four types of engaged learners and how we
Hmm.
can be all those types of levels of engagement every day, no
Hmm.
matter what we're doing. So I thought that was a great book. And then my favorite resource is the So Awkward podcast, and
Okay.
based upon the book This Is So Awkward by Dr. Cara Natterson and Vanessa Kroll Bennett. I got to meet them at the AMLE conference. They had a session later on, so I totally fangirled with them. They have an incredible resource. Dr. Natterson is a pediatrician, so they talk about the gamut of puberty, which is just really important. And I try to pull all those things together in my presentations for teachers because I know it's overwhelming to look at all these different resources and say, how am I to make sense of that. So I really try to pull those together in my presentations with teachers. So
Yeah.
it's a
So you,
passion for me for sure.
yeah, yeah, definitely. I took note of those resources, and I
Hmm.
hope people will, engage more with that. I think brain science is something that, like, if you're like the two of us and we listen to podcasts, we read books, you get that information. But if you're working in a school, it's not necessarily something they do a lot of PD on,
Correct.
right?
Right.
So,
Hmm.
like, unless it's something you're telling, you know, that you're going to give this PD because that's important at your school, right? A lot of the time schools are focused on test scores and other things, and the PD is going to be about data driven instruction and those types of
Yeah.
things. So,
Hmm.
but it's like, to get the better test scores, you need to understand the
Right.
teenage brain. And I think it's like, yeah, and understanding also when you have kids at home, like why they're reacting like this. And it made me think, I know the book The Anxious Generation is
Yep. Hmm.
pretty popular right now, and
Yeah.
a lot of the like the decisions that different school districts are making about cell phone policies is based on that book. And I think once a cell phone policy is made, they do need to enforce
Yeah.
it, which
Yep.
is not
Hmm.
always being the case, whether or not they have yonder pouches. So
Yep. All right.
it's really like you see the difference when kids are not connected to their device, and they're actually interacting with
Yep.
people. So yeah, I think you made a lot of good points about like just the reactions to stuff. And like I think in terms of media, I think they interact with different things. I mean, there's a lot of things that make us anxious about the current
Mm,
events, but my teens don't necessarily,
right.
they kind of know the overarching what's happening, but like they're not as involved in like reading about the
Right.
details, right? So I guess in a way they might be. Luckily, they're not like as preoccupied maybe as adults are
Yeah.
with those things, right? But I do think it's that's why we get the reactions when we have kids that have the girl drama, or
Right.
the
Exactly.
breakups
Right.
and those types of things, right? So
Yeah, their ability to regulate their emotions and come up with real rational understanding of
yeah,
situations, regardless of whether or not it's the state of the world or if it's the state of the lunch table, right,
yeah,
is all basically the same because they're overwhelmed with
yeah.
things around them and I've asked this question of different audiences before of just would you want what would you tell your teenage self now if you were to go back in time, and would
Yeah.
you redo your teenage years over again? And like overwhelmingly people say no, I don't want to go back there. And
Mm-hmm.
if we don't want to go back there to our more simple times, I suppose, if we want to call it, just taking out the cell phone and just taking out the internet access and just general, imagine sort of what it might feel like to be a teenager kind of living now, not knowing that there were simpler times and really just feeling very overwhelmed with just feeling like they're kind of always on. And that's what Jonathan Haidt talks about in The Anxious Generation, like getting rid of the phone. It's not just necessarily about getting rid of the physical phone, but about then incorporating play and incorporating more of those carefree experiences that previous generations had had. And that's why they were less anxious, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because we don't have that data necessarily, but we could assume that they were. But in my particular school, and this is the same, I talk about in my presentations as well that I feel like teenagers are a little bit like puppies, and I try not to like, I'm not making that like seem super simple, like that's not my
Mhm.
intention. But when you think about a puppy, and I'm right, I have Bear, my, as you mentioned in my intro, is my new yellow Labrador puppy. He is 15 weeks old, so we are in the just in the throes of creating him into being a good dog, right? It's
Yeah.
all about routine. And teenagers are just like that, all about routine for them. And so, our district, we don't have yonder pouches. We have cell phones are away during instructional time. And the teachers who build that into their routine and the kids feel it in the routine, those classes are at nearly cell phone free, as in like I see them all in the pouch that we have on the pouches on their doors or on their walls or whatnot, and they're not bothered by it. Not to say it's perfect all the time, but it's about routines and also explaining the why of it. If we explain, we can't just take away phones and just say they're bad for you. That's it. I'm not, because I said so type of thing. That was a line my mother used to say to us, my sister and I a lot, because I said
Yeah.
so. And I never understood. So why so say so, And so when we give the students and teenagers the opportunity to learn why this is an issue,
Yeah.
why we are worried, why this could potentially be harming their brain development, which and studies show that it does.
Yeah.
Then we use that. So we together are going to come up with some solutions. And at this
Yeah.
point, if you take just a general classroom, if I were teaching again, my goal would be like, our goal here is to do world history, and we're going to do it for the next 55 minutes, and we're going to do it without a notification, or we're going to do it without TikTok. We're going to do it without a text from mom. Let's just do it together. And I don't know if it would work perfectly every day. Absolutely no, it wouldn't. But it's
Mm.
about routine, and it's explaining that. Kids feel, so much about engagement attaches to their agency and the feeling that they can control so much. Because you think of a
Yeah.
typical 13, 14, 15-year-old, how much lack of control, I don't know if that's redundant, but the lack of control they feel like they have, right? They can't drive, right? They have to ask permission to go places, all completely, acceptable things they're supposed to do. But when we begin to engage them in decision making, or in the reasons why we're doing something, or getting them part of the process, we see a lot more engagement. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, Jenny Anderson and Rebecca Winthrop talk about that in their Disengaged Teen book, which isn't, I know I had mentioned it before, but that one really helped to kind of shift my thinking. I had one more book I wanted to mention too, just as a resource.
Mhm.
This is a fun one for any teachers, even parents of neurodivergent kids. It's ADHD is Awesome. It's by
Okay.
Kim and Penn Holderness.
Yeah.
Um, they're the Holderness family on social media, and that's a great one because Penn Holderness has ADHD, and he wrote like a really great book about understanding it. And as a non-ADHD person, but as a
Hmm.
person married to one and with a stepdaughter, that was really helpful. It definitely connects to the teenage brain, because even if a teenager doesn't necessarily have a diagnosis of ADHD, there's lots of issues with attention in the brain just because of the nature of how it's wired, which I thought was really important too. So a little late
Yeah.
on that other recommendation, but thought I'd include it. So,
Yeah. 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 And I follow them as well. So
oh,
I have
good.
not read the book, but I should
Yeah.
probably pick it up. I have a 10-year-old with ADHD. So yeah.
It's just a good, I have it somewhere in my bookshelf,
Mhm.
but it's a great design of the book too. When you like a book design, it's got
Mhm.
pictures and images, and it's kind of cool. So it's a good
Yeah.
one.
So you also write a blog on your website. Talk to me
Yes.
about like maybe how often the blog comes out, what you focus on in the blog, etc.
So my blog, I have a 2026 goal of interacting with it more,
Okay.
to incorporate more of the stories. I'm really attached, or I'm going to be doing more where it comes to, like in January, I have a couple of goals for connecting topics related specifically to motivation. When we think of
Okay.
like the New Year's resolution type of thing, motivation in the brain. Um, I've written a lot on my blog post about some personal experiences, both as a person who was a teenager and also as a stepmom.
Mhm.
My blog kind of really runs the gamut of personal stories and more connecting readers to facts and to articles and to studies they might not necessarily just find on their own, because their
Okay.
feed and their interest is probably not going to be on teen brain science.
Mhm.
And my blog ideas are actually going to be morphing into a book that I'm putting together. I'm hoping to
Okay.
finish up by the end of 2026. I'm doing a keynote in Maine in 2027. So I'm super
Okay.
excited about that. So my goal is to really have that book ready for that keynote as well. But the book will follow some of the things that I've discussed in the blog, and my blog, therefore, is going to kind of lead up to some ideas about the book.
Mhm.
And the goal is to use it as a resource for teachers, essentially a teacher's guide to understanding the teenage brain. And so my blog focuses a little bit about on that. So, and I send my blog out in my newsletters that
Okay.
are attached to my email list. I can give that information later on too. So yeah, a lot of cool things. And the goal is, again, I don't feel like the typical person, the typical educator, like you said, is
Mhm.
probably studying a lot of the brain or really focused on that. they're probably focused more on things related to classroom management or how to connect to the standards, or like you said,
Mhm.
on data and test scores and what their administrators are asking of them, what their districts are asking of them. But the kind of common denominator of all of that is understanding the brain sitting before them. And
Mhm.
so I try to use my platform essentially through the blog and my social media as a way to kind of spark a little bit of peak interest for
Mhm.
those who are just interested in it. So,
Yeah, and when the book comes out, you can definitely be a repeat guest on the podcast.
excellent. Would love that. Right. Would love that. So I'm excited for it.
Mhm.
I'm really excited about putting out something that I want it to be a useful resource, not
Mhm.
a PD book that you get when you sign up for some professional development somewhere, and it's more words than anything else. I want it to be like dog-eared. Um, it's actually the design is going to include almost like a choose your own adventure piece. If I
Okay.
start talking about something in chapter 1, and if this piques your interest and you like this particular topic, jump to chapter 10 where I'm going to dive into it more. So it's
Okay.
not something you have to read start to finish or beginning to end, rather. It's something where you can really use it as a true resource. So that's my goal. I felt like that's what would have made the difference for me when I
Yeah.
was teaching. If I could have had resources that really showed me why the kids in my class were doing the things that they were doing. Why is this happening? Essentially, I wanted to know that. And
Mhm.
that's the goal of that resource. So
Yeah, yeah, and I feel the same way, having taught roughly the same period of time. So yeah,
yeah.
it's but now, just researching on my own, like it's good to learn as I support teachers, right?
Yeah,
And
right,
knowing
right.
like maybe they haven't read about it, but something I can share with them and help them understand. So so you as you mentioned, you do conference speaking.
Yep.
So are you open to consulting or speaking with other districts and other states?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a really great 3-part workshop that I've put
Mhm.
together for the state of Connecticut, but I'm looking to really make it customizable for any particular situation. I did some work with a district this year. I had to navigate my own schedule as a school administrator, as my priority is making sure I'm taking care of my school, my students, and my teachers. But I was able to customize a program that really fit into their faculty meetings.
Okay.
But I have a larger. I've done 2 to 3 day workshops. The first kind of half day is about the facts about the teenage brain. So we dive into those 3 parts. We dive into other things that connect to the brain: social media, social relationships, even substance use, because that's something that's also really close to my heart. Because I think there's so much, both as teachers and parents, that they don't understand about the current substances that our young
Mhm.
people are navigating, experimenting with. And I don't even think really the medical field truly understands what will happen years down the road based upon some of the exposure our kids have had. So there's that first part, and then it gets into how do you take this information and how do you shift social emotional wellness and restorative practices to answer what's happening to the brain. And then the third part is looking at instructional strategies that kind of can tap into the engagement part of the brain. So it's how do we shift our practices? How do we incorporate not just necessarily movement or music, but how do we do it with real intention,
Okay.
because the brain needs it, not because, oh, it's kind of a cool thing that people do on social media. Let's do a brain break. It's because the teenage brain actually requires a little bit of a break. So I have those
Mhm.
3 parts that I do, but again, they're customizable. I'd love to do whole presentations just on substances, especially for parents and teachers, or for administrators as well. The piece that I did on joy for AMLE, I'm pulling more parts of that presentation of joy into when I'm doing my keynote in Maine. So I'm excited about
Mhm.
that. So again, I essentially feel like the sky is the limit, because no matter what happens in education, we will always have teenage brains sitting before us.
Yeah.
And I feel like just continuing to encourage conversations with educators about the brain and how really I want it to be empowering for them, that they have so much power to shift the dynamics of their classrooms. And it
Mhm.
can't be an us versus a them type of
Sure.
experience.
Sure.
It's a relationship. It's a community that they can create. And when created intentionally, I truly believe that kids just do better.
Yeah.
When practices shift, when adult-driven practices shift, kids and adults do better. So my PDs really kind of run the gamut of a number of those different topics. So I am like lit up by talking about it. And even when I've done those presentations, like in AMLE, there's like a part of it where I'm like, yes, this is where I feel awesome. Like just,
Yeah.
yeah, I loved teaching and I so very much miss it. Um, so me leading these professional developments is my closest thing to getting back into the classroom, even though adults are essentially my students instead. So a lot of
No,
cool
I feel the
opportunities
same.
for sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. Well, we've had a great conversation today
Yeah.
around your just shift into learning about brain science by gaining your stepkids and really kind of reflecting back on your teaching practice now that you're in administration. Out of everything we've talked about today, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
It's really two things. I talk about this in my presentations. I haven't mentioned it yet, but the teenage brain right now, so between the ages of 10 to 25, that time period in their lives is the most powerful and yet the most vulnerable. Their brains are the most powerful and the most vulnerable at that time than they ever will be. So there's so much power and potential in this age group. They are not lazy. I mean, maybe they could sometimes be a little lazy, but their brains are not, they're not built to be lazy.
Yeah.
Currently, right now, they are built to be the most connected that they ever will be. And I just think that's really important for educators to understand and parents understand that the kids sitting at your dinner table who've done the stupid thing that you're just talking to them about, what in fact, that brain is the most powerful it will ever be
Mm,
right now at this time period in their lives. So I just think there's so much power to that. And then the second piece I'd mentioned before is that nothing can get through that rational brain
mhm.
until it's gone through the emotional brain first. And
Yeah.
so once that emotional brain is calmed down, when a kid feels safe, when a teenager feels like they are in control of their environment, then the rational thinking comes. The what were you thinking is sort of a kind of empty kind of question because they weren't if they're living in their emotional brain. So those two things, the brain is the most powerful and yet the most vulnerable right now at this time period
Yeah.
as teenagers. And that emotional brain rules everything. And so I feel like if adults, any adults, just understand those two things and keep them in the back of their mind when they're dealing with teenagers, I think that they would have a shift in perspective and sort of what to do next with them.
Yeah, that's so important to remember. Where can people connect with you and find you online?
Awesome. So they can find me on the teenagebrainthing.com. That's my
Mhm.
website. If they want to email me, it's my full name, Jennifer Otte, OTTE, at theteenagebrainthing.com. And then they can find me on Instagram at the_teenage_brain_thing. So those all three places I'm easily accessible and anyone can reach out to me, DM, send me an email, connect with me on my website. Those are the big places. So.
Great, great. Well, I'll make sure to include those resources in the show notes. Thank you so much for being my guest on the Out of the
Thank
Trenches
you.
podcast today, and hope to see you again once your book is published.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Dana. Thank you.